Now, there are 5 reasons why a book would be banned from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And I skipped the 3rd one because that's the one that Paradise is accused of. A publication contains material that a reasonable person would construe as written solely for the purpose of communicating information designed to achieve a breakdown. Not just your average breakdown, but a breakdown of prisons through inmate disruption, such as strikes or riots. I was amused to get this, but I was also thrilled. It seemed like an extraordinary compliment.
It's great to have you with us, unfortunately, under these circumstances, though congratulations on what often happens is that when you have a book censored like this, your book Mouse, about Mouse and about Mauschwitz, right, Auschwitz, it shoots to the top of the bestseller list. You cannot get it in bookstores now. It is hard to get online. It'll take weeks or months to get.
It insults me because it's a degrading concept and a degrading way of looking at people, but it's bad art because it doesn't tell the truth, and fiction demands the truth.
Okay, this is what we're doing and this is what we're not doing. We are not talking about book bans today. We're talking about the response to book bans, particularly Black book bans, and what that response means for us as people who consider ourselves critical readers. But we are gonna have to go through what is a book ban, right? And just what is the political storm that we are in right now.
Well, school districts and Republican-controlled state legislatures have rapidly intensified efforts to ban certain books about race, colonialism, and gender identity from public classrooms and libraries, while placing sharp limits on what can be taught in schools. According to PEN America, more than 70 bills to impose educational gag orders have been introduced or pre-filed just in the past month. Meanwhile, the American Library Association says it's received an unprecedented 330 reports of efforts to ban books. Many of the efforts are being led by a number of right-wing groups, including Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Education, and No Left Turn in Education. All 3 groups have ties to a right-wing network funded by Charles Koch and others.
More than 5,000 schools nationally have had books barred from access by students in libraries and classrooms, according to a report compiled by PEN America. And most of them are Black and LGBTQ books. That is what we know. The contemporary nature of book bans are very just unserious things that are fueled by very unserious people, like these people.
Even children's books are coming under attack.
They include a book called Anti-Racist Baby by Ibram Kendi. Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
It's out of the library. What are you going to do with them? You going to put them in the street? Light them on fire? Where are they going?
Representative Sexton.
I don't have a clue, but I would burn them.
At the home of Robin Steenman, the leader of the local Moms for Liberty chapter. That's a conservative organization that says it advocates for parents' rights. Both women object to some well-known books on the public school reading list.
It's very divisive and racially charged, and it focuses 100% on the negatives and how, the white people were racist and what they did to Ruby, and it just leaves kids feeling bad. History should be taught, absolutely, warts and all, but just teach history without, agenda or ideology or trying to put a child in one box or another, because history has the lessons of its own.
Only 22% of children's books published in 2016 were about people of color, and fewer than 13% of books published were written by people of color or Native Americans. Capitalist white supremacy is inherently anti-intellectual. The purpose of schooling in the history of America has been to reproduce the capitalist status quo while being flexible enough to practice a predatory inclusion of the marginalized for future profit aims. It doesn't always work and naturally breeds resistance through curriculum. And then the capitalist, racist, patriarchal status quo has to recreate moral panic that can be backed up by policy or violence, which is the same word. Hence the book bans. And specifically for what we're talking about here today, we know that the oldest book bans for Black people were the literal anti-literacy laws that were set in place during slavery, where you could get your finger chopped off if you even dared to read. So these current book bans are really being pushed by these politicians who are trying to capitalize off of racial and sexual anxieties by really far right-wing, unserious people. And they're doing this for votes. Their anxieties are in response to perceived structural change, perceived increase of Black representation in literature and books in general. Anything resembling the historical perspective of the people who make America's imperialist and Western goals seem just bad. The goal really is to just block people from being able to analyze their past and their present. All of this is under the premise of protecting children from things that they're not ready for, which is always just insulting to children and the intelligence that children have. Again, that's not the purpose of this here video. Today we're talking about the response to book bans, specifically the bans on black books and black responses to book bans. If you are interested in reading some of these banned book lists, that is a great thing. They are potentially great places for you to start your curiosity and just figure out where you are and where you want to go, and maybe it can be a doorway. Anyway, sometimes though,
that means sometimes,
there is this false equivalency that happens where, because a book is on a banned list, we praise it to such a certain height that we forget to be critical of that book and whether or not that book is even useful for teachers and students in the classroom in the first place. Not to mention organizers and political educators too. Are they useful to individuals and collectives who are serious about sustainable black liberation?
And I thought, why? Why do I care if they freak out? I mean, what do I get out of it? And then I thought maybe their freakouts are like some kind of compass for me, you know? Like I know I'm doing what I want to do if it freaks them out. And then I thought, what if I don't want to do what I want to do because I want to do it, but because they don't want me to? I mean, what if I don't like what I like because I like it, but because my mother doesn't like it? What if I don't like what I seem to like?
The Nashville Public Library has now curated a banned books collection for its patrons.
So throughout the video, I'm going to try to center in on 3 main examples and talk about them very briefly because we cannot be here this long. So we're going to go with 1 nonfiction book, 1 fiction book, and 1 children's book. So book bans are censorship, and all censorship requires surveillance. Now when it comes to black books, that requires a special type of surveillance called racial surveillance. So we're just going to jump right over to Simone Brown's book right now. So the book that we're going to be referencing is Simone Brown's Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, and this book came out in 2015 under Duke University Press. So Simone introduces us to this topic of racializing surveillance, which is a technology of social control where surveillance practices, policies, and performances concern the production of norms pertaining to race and exercise a power to define what is or in out of place. So that's the book bans. So then Simone Brown introduces us to this topic of Souveillance. So there's surveillance and there's Souveillance. So extending Steve Mann's concept of Souveillance, which he describes as a way of enhancing the ability of people to access and collect data about their surveillance and to neutralize surveillance. I use the term dark surveillance as a way to situate the tactics employed to render oneself out of sight. I plot dark surveillance as an imaginative place from which to mobilize a critique of racializing surveillance, a critique that takes a form of anti-surveillance, counter-surveillance, and other freedom practices. So surveillance is watching the watcher. So we know examples like the Black Panthers doing cop watch on the police, right? Simone Brown gives us other examples of dark surveillance, which looked like Negro spirituals, flyers that would tell colored people of Boston to keep a sharp lookout for kidnappers, police, slave catchers. Folk tunes like Run Nigga Run.
Run nigga run, powder don't get you, run nigga run, you better get away. Nigga run, the nigga flew, the nigga lost his Sunday shoes. Run nigga run, the powder don't get you, run nigga run, you better get away.
And that was supposed to be like the cue, like, hey, watch out. The song itself is surveillance. And so black people putting out banned book lists are a form of surveillance. It is critiquing the surveillance that is being put on black authors and black books. So Simone Brown also cites this guy by the name of Gary T. Marx, not to be confused with Karl Marx, different Marx. Matter of fact, I'm just going to call him Gary T. So Gary T. talks about this idea of a maximum security society, which is the new type of contemporary surveillance state that we are currently living in. So he says, in it, everyone is rendered suspicious at some time or another, while some individuals might be more often subject to what Gary T terms categorical suspicion, given their ascribed membership in certain groups. This is black people. So black books have this categorical suspicion that other books may not have, right? Just by default, being black, writing the book being about black people, makes it that much more susceptible to capitalist, patriarchal, racist, white-wing surveillance. So I think we're clear on the surveillance till the banned books is the surveillance, and then the banned book list that people are encouraging people to read because the books have become banned. That's the surveillance, specifically a dark surveillance. So what happens when dark surveillance goes wrong? What happens when after a book becomes banned, that book and thereby that author, that black author, they're put on a pedestal of sorts that sometimes the book deserves and sometimes it may not, and things aren't always a binary. So we're gonna get into that later too. What I'm saying is that sometimes putting too much energy on what our enemies are doing, or the people who disagree with us politically are doing, can distract us from what we actually want to be doing. Books, like movies, films, corporate-owned news, radio stations, social media, advertisements, books are media. We just have to understand it. Books are media. And we should practice critical media literacy with all the media that we consume, especially the media that we enjoy. This includes being able to understand how the media is created, but also what are the political ideas within it, the audience that it's meant for, who it leaves out, and the purpose for creating it in the first place. We tend to do a good job of this on the racial level. But once the representation is taken care of and everyone in the book is now black, and we're dealing with black people all throughout the book, we sometimes can put our critical reading lenses down. No books, absolutely no books are apolitical or politically neutral. All stories are political, whether it is intentional or not. There are politics in every story that we read. So for example, even if we were telling a black story about a little black boy and he's going to the grocery store with his grandpa and they're going to pick out groceries. So already so many things are taken for granted that are highly political in this story. It normalizes the idea of a grocery store and purchasing food at a market price. Food that was produced by farm workers under capitalism. In order to tell the stories, we have to take these things for granted. The personal is always political. All of our daily choices are rooted in our socioeconomic, environmental, political reality, especially when those stories happen in books. So the people on the right, when they create a book ban or they decide that they don't like a book, and they put all of those books together in these huge book ban lists that they create, what it does for black political thought is it lumps a lot of black ideas and authors into the same list. People who may not even agree with each other. But the way the mainstream white capitalist gaze frames black books and black authors is that they're somehow inherently critical in and of themselves. Because in racial capitalism and neoliberalism, people equate identity with a certain level of politics. Politicians run with it anyway. So what does that create? What does that create? That creates a culture where people can do this slippery slope where they're using black people and black books and black authors as sort of an aesthetic, as a mood, a political mood specifically. People are using black books as political virtue signaling without ever opening the book or critically engaging with the ideas in the book. So then it's just like, okay, is this book actually saying something of substance, or was this book marketed as something of substance. Now we have this black book, and in the book we see a challenge to overt white supremacy, Trump and far right and KKK historically. You get the picture, right? Burning crosses on your grandmother's lawn, that type of book. But other than that, and then other than the representation of the black people in the book and the anger at white supremacy, everything else is pretty much left intact. The ideology of the state isn't challenged. Colonialism isn't challenged. Patriarchy is unchallenged. Class exploitation is still normalized. Militarization, tourism economies for people's vacations in the book. The police, that's all good. So we know that blackness and criticality is not a one-to-one. So one doesn't equal the other thing. We know under racial capitalism, black people can be anti-black. Black people can believe in and support the prison industrial complex. Black women can hold patriarchal views. And black people in the United States can hold imperialist views about the rest of the black diaspora. And that used to be me. I used to think that that was all we needed. I thought, one, representation is great. And it is. I want to be clear. Representation is great. It's one of the things that gets people to stay in the book. If you know that the people in the book look like you, sound like you, and experiencing things that you've gone through. That's one of the key things that keep people reading across their lives, being exposed to books with people who look like them. And politically, it's just like, all right, cool. Books by black people and about black people on a political spectrum tend to be more progressive in general. So it's just like, all right, cool. But not all banned books are the same. And some of the books that get on these lists, I'm very surprised sometimes, because I'm just like, how did the right wing even get their hands on this knowledge, Because some of the books that we come across, like Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde, one of the most transformative books that I've ever read. Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I'm just like, I'm for sure these people are not reading these books because these are great books, and I really want to be clear about that. But some are boring, some are not great at all, and some are politically dangerous. There is a difference between a book being banned from prison libraries across the nation because they are said to potentially
Communicating information designed to achieve a breakdown. Not just your average breakdown, but a breakdown of prisons.
incite riots among prisoners once the prisoners read them, because they are challenging whether or not the US is an actual democracy and not just a fascist state, or calling for the abolition of prisons. So there's that book, and then there's just books with black people in them that generally support dominant state ideology anyway, right? Nothing else really changes. Two different books. The bar is low for what can get on a banned book list. These people are unserious. They don't care. So here's a quote from Dorothy Hunton, who is a black radical, and she is reflecting on essentially McCarthyism and anti-radicalism in the during the McCarthy era, which was the late 40s, early 50s in the United States during the early Cold War. So she says McCarthy's authority, McCarthyism. Please, you just gotta look it up at this point. Anti-radical, anti-black. There you go. McCarthy's authority reached even into the U.S. overseas libraries, where hundreds of books by 40 authors were yanked from the shelves by the State Department. Oddly, outstanding among the works singled out for elimination were the distinguished contributors on the subject of race discrimination, especially anti-black oppression in the U.S. The purpose was, of course, to sow the seeds of suspicion of those writers who had the nerve to reveal or reject American racial inequalities. Weren't they adhering to the red line? Consequently, their writings must be subversive. So what she's saying is like, the logic of black, therefore this, is ridiculous. It's ridiculous when the anti-radical, anti-black Cold War state does it and says if they're black and they're pushing for anything that looks like racial equality, they must be communists, which we know is not true. We know there are a bunch of black people, Martin Luther King himself included, that were not, adamantly not. A lot of people during in the NAACP adamantly not communists, but were framed as communists. Their work was framed as anti-capitalist, as subversive against the state, when they were just reformist at best. That happens on the flip side with some of these black book bans. It's just like, oh, it was banned by these right-wing Republicans. It was banned by Mothers of Liberty. Therefore, they're so subversive. They're so critical, when it's just like, yeah, maybe they might not be. We shouldn't just think that off rip. We should go into them and see for ourselves. So then one of the problems is that the question now for teachers and educators and political organizers, the question becomes whether or not you teach banned books, as opposed to, do you teach critical books consistently, whether they're banned or not? Do you do critical pedagogy just as principle?
We recently started a banned books book club.
So many young people are creating their own book clubs, or finding these books, they're teaching each other, they're reading these books, because we know that that's how change happens.
Which reminds me of this one June Jordan quote where she's talking about the spirit of resistance, and she says one of the core elements of the spirit of resistance is that it's immune to enemy assessment. It's immune to enemy assessment. The enemy can't assess what we got going on here, and our standards are not based on their standards. We have higher standards.
It's like the freedom riders who said, you don't get to tell us where to sit, you don't get to tell us where to eat, you don't get to tell us what to drink. We decided you don't get to tell us what to read, you don't get to tell us what to teach, you don't get to tell us what to learn. So what we've done is decided to give 6,000 books away, all of the titles that they don't want us to learn. So what we want you to do is help yourself to books that we have brought here for you.
This is not a diss to the African American Policy Forum or Kimberly Crenshaw at all. I'm saying that genuinely. The African American Policy Forum does good work, and Kimberly Crenshaw has done good work. What I'm focusing on is this call to push books because they were banned, as opposed to books that we choose ourselves because we like them. Now, if there's overlap, that's fine. If there's not, and it's just read this because they don't like it. Because what it does is it promotes consumption as solution. Again, which is the neoliberal solution always. The market is always the solution. Buy more. It is the way that capitalist, racist, patriarchal hegemony under consumerism can sell our revolutions and our movements back to us. And Jared Ball has a whole book about this, The Myth of Black Buying Power. And Lester Spence, too, in his book. He has a good book on this, the neoliberal turn in black politics. Really, shows that up. And I think we're seeing that in the commodification of surveillance, or of being surveilled, under the premise of surveilling the surveillors, like Souveillance. I'm just talking. This is so weird. This is the first time I've done this without a script. It makes me think of this Lauren Michelle Jackson article, and I'm gonna post it. Who is the anti-racist book list for? And in it, similar to the banned book list, a little different, right? But she says, still, I'm left to wonder, who is this for? The syllabus, as these lists are sometimes called, seldom instructs or guides. It is no pedagogue. As in, it's not really teaching. It's like, it is unclear whether each book supplies a portion of the holistic racial puzzle, or are intended as revelatory islands in and of themselves. It's just like, are we supposed to learn from these book bans, or are we just sort of like doing this as a jab to the right? Again, and I can't stress this enough, just because your enemy doesn't like it doesn't mean you have to like it. Which brings us to the 1619 Project. And looking at the book, we understand that there was the 1776 Project that Trump was trying to back against the 1619 Project, and all of these people equating critical race theory with the 1619 Project. We remember all of that. What it evades, though, propping up the 1619 Project without consideration of all of the properties of the 1619 Project, you might start agreeing with something you might not readily agree with. Again, Lauren Michelle Jackson was able to bring this out in her article about the 1619 Project, which got Nicole Hannah-Jones very upset. I'm not going to go into that, but things were said on Twitter that day. But I think her quote is really useful because it actually gets us to think about the book and the fact that books written by Black people aren't the Bible. The Bible isn't even the Bible. It's debated. And these books should be read and politically debated. Don't let these books slide into some sort of like this is where we're at in terms of black thought, and this doesn't need to be critiqued any further because the right dislikes it, that we feel that we need to prop it up as some holy, what's the word I'm looking for? Relic. This is Lauren Michelle Jackson talking about the patriotism in the 1619 Project in one of the essays that Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote. The imposition of patriotism is more bothersome than any debated factual claim. In spite of all the ugly evidence it has assembled, the 1619 Project ultimately seeks to inspire faith in the American project just as any conventional social studies curriculum would. Let's think about really what we're talking about here. So, the 1619 Project falls in the tradition, a historic African-American literary tradition that Imani Perry calls sympathetic occupation. In sympathetic occupation, racial ideology can be reformed, challenged, or reconceived. Simply put, this trope has been used as a means of struggling for the application of the principles of liberty and justice substantively to the lives of black people. But then, Imani Perry tells us some of the limitations of sympathetic occupation. Limitations that we can apply to some of the passages and the overall political project of the 1619 Project. Additionally, sympathetic occupation continues to include the frequent celebration of American exceptionalism, even as it exposes the hypocrisies of American rhetoric. However, it should be critiqued as it critiques, acknowledging that the tools for social transformation might be useful even as they are forged in the dominant epistemological universe. Epistemology is just the way that people go about knowing. And in this case, white supremacist patriarchal capitalism frames our ways of knowing as opposed to an indigenous epistemology or an African epistemology or a feminist epistemology, for example. Which epistemology are you appealing to in order to get liberty and justice? We need to ask those questions when we're looking at books like the 1619 Project. Toni Morrison has this great quote in The Source of Self-Regard where she says, "You will see at once how dispiriting this project of drawing or building or constructing fiction out of history can be, or that it is easy and it's seductive to assume that data is really knowledge, or that information is indeed wisdom, or that knowledge can exist without data, and how easy and how effortlessly one can parade and disguise itself as another." We need to be very careful about the things we take for granted just because a black person wrote it. One can look at the history of segregation and redlining and racial housing covenants in the suburbs and the history of housing segregation. You can have the same historical information and then come away with a different analysis. Some of us might have an anti-capitalist analysis. Another person might have a more reformist, financial literacy, black entrepreneur, black capitalist approach, a Jay-Z, Kanye West, Bill Cosby approach. Same history. The facts are good. That's the thing. The facts are good. Analysis. Du Bois has this great quote from 1926 from his essay, Criteria of Negro Art. He's talking about what makes black art, and the obligations of black authors. And he asked a very important question. He says, what do we want? What is this thing that we're after? We want to be Americans, full-fledged Americans with all the rights of other American citizens, but is that all? Do we want simply to be Americans? Once in a while, through all of us, there are flashes of some clairvoyance. We who are dark can see America in a way that white Americans cannot. And seeing our country thus, are we satisfied with its present goals and ideals? Damn it, I could, so good. So I'm really wrestling with this idea of the obligation of the black author. Why even call yourself a black author, right? And this is no shade to any black author on any one of these banned book lists, right? But what's going on? Are there obligations to working class black people suffering under neo-colonialism throughout the diaspora, black people suffering under predatory capitalism? What is our obligation as black writers to black people. And the thing is hard. It's hard with fiction. It's easier with the nonfiction, but it's hard with fiction. And sometimes what we can see in fiction books is there's a lot of data, a lot of information that we're given, and then the author resolves it in a solution to that issue. And we can look at the political differences of black authors in the solutions that they give. Some might lean towards individual responsibility, and that can look like building some sort of mental and psychological fortitude against discrimination itself. Just, don't let it bother you. It could look like voting, and that could look like just speaking out on YouTube or on your Instagram, tweeting a hashtag, or just saying Black Lives Matter. Like, that's it. That's it. That is the solution. Being forthright against all those things within yourself, and that's where it stops. And then some black authors might have a book that has a more collective response, and that also includes voting, but more voting in the organizing sense. Everybody gather around, let's do this thing together and work together for some sort of end. We can all collectively demand more representation. We can do charity. We can sign up for the soup kitchen or something of that nature. And these can all overlap in the same book. That's the thing. But we have to ask ourselves, what's the main idea that's being pushed to the reader? And it's not a one-to-one. The author's intention can have very different reception, and we can receive something that the author did not intend. There's the author who pushes a more structural analysis that looks at capitalism, that looks at the way that race and class and patriarchy are operating together, and calls us to dismantle those structures as opposed to trying to live within them and trying to make those structures better. It's no, just abolish the whole thing. 3 different authors, 3 different books, same information, say police brutality, overt discrimination, whatever, completely different solutions that they give to their protagonists. There's this book, Black Cake, that I read earlier this year by Charmaine Wilkerson. This is, I think it was published this year. Yeah, 2022. So it's a great story. I loved reading this book. I do recommend reading this book if you are Jamaican, exploring family dynamics. A mother passes on. Her 2 children are wrestling with their mother's legacy after she leaves. Fine, cool. However, let's take a look at the author's note, because this is a book set in the Caribbean during a very political time. And it's set also in America, and she says, despite the use of some historical and present day context, this narrative focuses primarily on the emotional lives of the invented characters and is meant to be fable-like in its recounting of some of its main events. For fictional stories more deeply rooted in the political and social discourse of multicultural lives in various Caribbean countries and the Caribbean diaspora in the mid to late 20th century, I would like to remind readers that there are a number of wonderful authors to turn to, such as Edward Danticat, Marlon James, and Jamaica Kincaid. And I'm just Charmaine, that feels like a cop-out. It feels like a cop-out. Because this is a police state. America is a police state. People in America, where your book is being published, and I would also argue people in Jamaica, are pro-police, right? Therefore, when you read a book, if you are not explicit about what the politics are, different things can be taken away. And this is true for any book. But there are readers who can read this book. I'll just read you the quote. You have quotes like this. This is when Byron is talking about his sister Benny's and colorism impacting how much she gets pulled over by the police versus him, who gets pulled over much more because he's of darker complexion. But Benedetta Bennett, with her sand-colored skin, has never been pulled over by the police, while Byron averages 3 or 4 times a year. It's getting to the point where Byron is afraid to drive at night. It's gotten to a point where the last time he needed a new car, he bought a less sleek model, one that wouldn't catch the eye of someone who didn't think a black man should own a certain kind of vehicle. But he would never admit this to anyone. And this is very political. This is outrightly political. We're talking about police profiling. That's not just something you can throw into a neutral story. That's not fable-like. In a fable, there's still police. I get it. I have nuance. I get it. I'm just saying. By saying that the book is not political, normalizes things that are very political that you do have in the text. And the thing is, a book like Black Cake could end up on somebody's banned book list. Some right-wing Republican could read this and be like, I don't like it because I don't like how it promotes illegal immigration or blah, 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 blah. But because it is on that list, most likely it would probably get promoted to a level of non-criticism that it desperately still needs. I'm just trying to lay out that point. So now let's introduce a children's book. And this is the last book that we're going to talk about. And it's called Pies from Nowhere. It's a book about the true story of Georgia Gilmore and the Club from Nowhere, a grassroots project to provide food and funds for the Montgomery bus boycott. And I'm reading this article that's a part of Social Justice Books, a Teaching for Change project. And what they do is they basically vet children's books and write reviews for them. And one of the books that they're talking about is his book, Pies from Nowhere. And what's really cool is that Judy Richardson, who was a part of SNCC and is known for creating the documentary Eyes on the Prize, which is the civil rights documentary, she basically reached out to the author and was like, hey, there's some hiccups in this book. Yes, it's about Georgia Gilmore. However, the way you're portraying the civil rights movement needs some help. So Judy steps in and she just starts giving advice on how to rewrite the book to bring the attention to the collective nature of the movement and the structural nature of Jim Crow racism. And I think she did it in such an excellent way. She says, 1, avoid the passive voice. For example, the book says the next day a flyer was passed around rather than identifying a protagonist, such as the next day an association of black women distributed a flyer. 2, name other organizers besides Georgia Gilmore, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. Don't do this idealization of these mainstream people. It's so small, but it's so good. 3, don't make race invisible in the text when it is central to the story. For example, because she'd been treated poorly by the drivers so many times before, this should say white drivers. 4, make it clear that the practices were systemic, not personal. For example, after she had already paid, the driver demanded she get off the bus and enter through the back of the bus. The phrase should be added, as black people were required to do back then. This was the usual systemic procedure. The driver wasn't just making an exception of her personality. And 5, make the motive clear. In the author's note, it says, many whites also aided the bus boycott. And then Judy basically explains like there were specific white motives. The truth is that most white women gave rides because they wanted their maids' labor. Again, a book like Pies from Nowhere could end up on someone's banned list. And then we could put that book in front of children. And this book is a perfect example of dominant ways of writing civil rights history, because the way we learn civil rights history is still contested right now. And I think the Pies from Nowhere example is really important because it gets to something that Sharice Burton-Stelly said. Pretty sure it was the Groundings podcast. One of the things she said was, I'm paraphrasing, like, Americans aren't anti-radical necessarily because they're not in alignment with those politics, but it's because that analysis just is not present anywhere in the educational or social or cultural atmosphere to even pull on.
But I think that the other thing too is what we have to understand is that anti-radicalism and a dearth of class analysis is endemic in the United States. And so it's not just an aversion, it's an inability. Like, people are literally ill-equipped to do that type of analysis.
So these moments of correction and redirection towards a collective view when it comes to narrative and how we shape narrative and leaning away from individualistic forms, ways of thinking, it just helps so much. Like, I really just have to shout out social justice books. They say, we examine the representation, the storyline, and the quality of writing of each book. It is not enough to simply diversify the characters in children's literature. We are also concerned with who is writing the stories, what the characters are doing, how issues of power and activism are introduced, and representations of people in community rather than in isolation. I will link everything I've said, I hope, but specifically social justice books. I will link the article in the show notes. Also, shout out to Teaching for Change in general. They are great. I think another good quote is this one from Imani Perry's The Year of Black Memoir from 2019. And she writes, however, in the current landscape, when Black life is so varied and complex, no memoir can stand as a singular representation of Black life, regardless of how compelling it might be. And then later on, at the end of the article, she has a great quote that says, if indeed Black memoir and Black literature are to be methods for us to understand race in America today, then each should be understood as one cry in the ring, a small piece of a mosaic, vast and ever-changing. They should be set amidst other forms of knowledge and considered carefully rather than treated with simplistic adulation. So all in all, when it comes to critical literacy and just critical reading, don't take your cues from the right wing. Don't take your cues from people who don't read and have no investment in Black liberation. It's important to know the level of surveillance that we're at when we're thinking about racial surveillance. It's important to know which states are doing what and which laws are banning which book for our own personal safety. But in terms of our political development, we shouldn't use these books that they choose as a standard from which to base what is necessary to study and what isn't. I'm losing my words. I can't talk right now. You get it by now. If you don't get it by now, start from the top, run it back. We need to read for ourselves. We need to read collectively in groups. Go to your local library, visit independent, radical, Black libraries, Black bookstores, your grandparents' basement library. Join radical reading groups. Reread books multiple times. Come to your own conclusions. It's not what you read as much as how you read it. That is going to be a topic for part 2, another video that is going to be about reading and capitalism. So look out for that one. This has been interesting. I'm gonna have a hard time editing this. So I'll end it there. Keep reading. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you make it this far in the video, thank you. And I'll see you next time. Peace. I did want to take the time to just shout out a book that I do like, which is Bitter by Akwaeke Emezi, the prequel to Pet by Akwaeke Emezi. And I just wanted to quickly share a quote that I do mess with in politics that gets to some things that we need to get to. Theron was evil. It was impossible to be a billionaire and be good. You couldn't make that kind of money without hurting people, without stealing from them, exploiting them, making them suffer while you accumulated wealth. That was impossible to spend in this lifetime, just sitting on it for nothing while others were struggling to stay alive.